You're listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, with service members from across the military sharing their stories of combat and survival. And now, here's your host, Mark Zeno.
Welcome into the Hazard Ground Podcast. Thank you guys always for being part of the show and listening. Make sure you guys go to iTunes, subscribe, rate, and review the show. Only takes a few seconds. More subscribers and reviews that we get, the more visibility the show gets. That helps us grow and helps us continue to bring you guys great guests, incredible stories from all over the globe. Again, these reviews, they don't got to be lengthy. They can be as short as you want. Just give us a rating. Tell us what you like, what you don't like. That feedback, we really take it into consideration when we look at getting guests. And, you know, the Hazard Ground Podcast is it's community and it's growing. We want to get as many listeners and supporters out there. You guys are a tremendous part of it, and we want you to be involved on everything that we're doing. And eventually that's where we want to go with the podcast, is take it to a in-studio place where we can get rid of call-in format and you guys can be part of the show and interact with the guests themselves. So we can't do that without your support. So again, please subscribe, rate, and review. Follow us on all the social media sites, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We're on all of them. And all of this goes towards making the show better for you, for our guests, and everyone involved. Joining us now on the Hazard Ground Podcast, his name is Jason Beighley. He spent over 25 years in the military in the special operations realm, and he was also part of the raid in Mogadishu, a.k.a. Black Hawk Down, as many of you know it from the book. We also had Matt Eversman on the podcast. He was our first episode. So, Jason, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.
All right, so let's start, as we always ask everybody. Why'd you join the military?
I was, 8 or 9 months out of high school back in the 80s and had no plans for it at all. And a couple of life changes, like losing jobs and things like that, kind of led me to it. And thought I would do a 4-year tour and go to Germany and get out. And 25 years later, there I was.
So when you look back on your career, was there something that made you stay, that you're like, this is the reason why I decided to stay?
I just kind of took a liking to it. It seemed like I had a bit of a predisposition for it that I didn't really know that I had, frankly. That's about it, really.
All right, so as you're going along through the military, you decide to go into the special operations realm. Why? Was there something that you saw? Was it something somebody told you about? How did that come?
I got into my first unit over in Germany in a mechanized infantry unit, which just didn't seem to me like it was much of a challenge like I thought it would. I mean, I didn't know anything before I went in the Army, so I assumed that everything in the Army was very difficult, and I didn't have any mentors. I didn't have any family members close by that I could reach out to and get any advice. So once I realized what the deal was after I got there, that not every single thing in the Army is as difficult as I thought it might be, I kind of started looking around, thinking that this is really all there is. And I ended up, through a series of events, with a company commander who had spent some time in the Ranger Regiment back in the early 80s, and he kind of mentored me a little bit and got me moving that direction.
Okay.
So that's the long and short of it.
So when you decided to go into this, was it because of the physical challenge? Was it because there was just a better opportunity for you? What were you thinking?
Yeah, both really. It was once I had my eyes open and realized that there were other things that sounded like they were more challenging and would be more gratifying. I ended up, doing the required Army paperwork to get myself in that direction after I finished my tour in Germany, and that led me to in a very brief version of it, an airborne school slot when I left Germany, which was basically a PCS change. Got to go to a school, and then I ended up going to Fort Knox, Kentucky, which is not an airborne unit, as everyone knows.
Uh-huh.
And then while I was there, I happened into a Ranger School slot, which I went to and passed. And then when it came time to re-enlist, I was still at Fort Knox, and now being an airborne qualified and Ranger qualified sergeant, my re-enlistment guy said that he could get me not into the regiment, but he could get me to a station of choice that was the deal that they were offering at that point. So I jumped at the chance and reenlisted and got myself a slot locked into Fort Lewis, Washington. And the guy told me, he goes, "You're just going to have to go up there and get yourself hired at the Ranger Battalion." So that's what I did.
I find that from a lot of people, and for those listening, not military, Fort Knox is a heavy armor place. There's not a lot of it's all tanks and armored personnel carriers and things of that nature. So it's not it's a different kind of infantry as opposed to the guys who like to put their boots on the ground and run and chase bad guys. And it's just for the non-military folks listening. But I find a lot of guys who go into special operations have to kind of work their way through it. It's not like you just raise your hand and go, "Hey, I just want to go be special ops," and they just say, "Yeah, go ahead, have at it." It's a lot of guys who have to work their way through the whole process. Was that difficult?
Not really. It was just more of a, I was kind of too young and too dumb to know any better. So, I put the paperwork in for the airborne school slot, and I went to my personnel guys. For those of you who speak the vernacular, I went to the S1 shop back when I was still in Germany, and they said, "Yeah, you got an airborne school date." And I said, "Okay, well, what about the Ranger school date?" Because I put in a paperwork for that as well. And the guy looked at me like I had horns, and he goes, "What are you talking about?" And I go, "Well, I put in for that as well." And so long story short, they finally traced that down. It's like, "Yeah, that one never got submitted. It was an oversight on our part. Sorry." But when I got to Fort Knox, no exaggeration, it almost fell out of the sky, because I was standing there in formation one day, and the first sergeant come walking out, and he goes, "We just had a bunch of Ranger school spots thrown at the battalion by the Army. Does anybody want to go?" And I'm standing there in formation as the squad leader, raise my hand, and there's not one other hand in the company was in the air, Mark.
Really?
1987.
Did that surprise you?
Yeah, it shocked the hell out of me. And I just kind of looked around the crowd going, I thought I was in the wrong place, in a place that I don't really want to be, that I don't really feel like I belong. But seeing that really solidified it for me. And then, of course, that was probably around April or so of that year. I think I left in July and came back in September successfully. And there was a guy in another company that had gone before me. And then it was kind of like, okay, well, other folks had been shown that it's actually a possibility when somebody else goes that and passes out. Now it's like, oh, well, maybe this is doable. And I think between September and January, when I left, another 5 or 6 guys went. It's kind of like they had to be shown what the realm of the possible was, and then they realized that, oh, maybe I could do that too.
It's interesting you tell that story, though, because I think a lot of people would feel like in that scenario when someone asks for, "Hey, does anybody want to go?" and you're the only person raising your hand, you're looking around, it's like crickets everywhere else. You almost feel like, hey, am I doing the wrong thing because nobody else wants this? What's wrong with me? But you seem to have the exact opposite feeling at that moment.
Yeah, I did, and I was so I just didn't take well to the mechanized lifestyle. It's all about maintenance. And I got a lot of respect for what those guys do. They have their place, and I did learn a lot when I was in that part of the Army. But I just have this strong dislike for riding around inside of a vehicle. I got myself into as a young man driving a vehicle, because I figure if I'm going to be inside of it, I'd rather have control of what's going on, and I'll take responsibility for the maintenance and all the other stuff, so I can be in the driver's seat and have my head out and see what's going on and have some situational awareness and not be stuck in the back.
No, that's fair. That makes a lot of sense. So when you get through Ranger School, you graduate, when you look back on that experience, what did you remember the most about it? What stood out to you?
The lack of food and the lack of sleep. It was just, I learned a lot there because I did not grow up in the regiment. And as, folks know, if anybody listening understands, the guys that grow up, inside the regiment from privates, they get a lot of mentorship and a lot of development knowledge that's going to help them get through Ranger School. And I did not get any of that stuff. I got a little bit through chance contact, but no directed, focused kind of training and knowledge. So I remember it as just being a scramble, trying to stay awake and trying not to think too much about food and just suffering through it. But it was nowadays when I look back to it, I just remember being tired, and I have a few glimpses of different things we did, field problems and 4 and 5 day patrols and stuff like that. But it was a good experience going to the regiment later on and learning those things week in and week out. And that's when it really solidified in my brain.
And for those non-military listening, the thing about Ranger School is physically it's demanding enough, but the other challenge is to keep you awake and keep you hungry and make you mentally exhausted and make you mentally struggle. So this way the physical things become that much harder. And that's really the challenge to get through it, is to be able to handle the mental rigors first, then the physical rigors afterwards. And if you can overcome that, you're eventually training yourself to handle very high stress situations. So that's kind of the biggest challenge. So after Ranger School, do you immediately go into Special Ops, or do you just kind of wait a little bit? You have another assignment? What's next?
I had, I went back to Fort Knox for about 4 months, I guess. Basically, as soon as I showed back up there, I was inside my window to re-enlist, and I went and talked to the re-enlistment guy, and then got myself set up for a January departure to go to Fort Lewis, to go to 2nd Bat. Well, really to go to Fort Lewis. There was no guarantee about anything from 2nd Bat, and that was just a few field problems still left to do at Knox. And there was, at that point, there was myself and one other. I was still in E5. We had an E6 in the company. We were the only 2 NCOs in the company that had Ranger tabs, and I think there was one officer that was not my platoon but a different one. And we were just, walking anomalies, and of course there was huge amount of expectation, just because I have this piece of cloth on my shoulder now, I'm this supposed expert with all this experience, and which is wrong, but that's the expectation that people have. Anyway, to answer your question, I left there in January, went home on 30 days of leave, and took a trip up to Fort Lewis while I was home, and met with the battalion CSM and begged for a job, and they hired me. I reported there in April.
Interesting. So for those listening,
88.
I was going to ask you what time frame that was. And for those listening, when he talked about the tab and the cloth on his shoulder, when you graduate from Ranger School, you wear kind of like it's a little arch that you wear, and it says Ranger on it, and it goes on your uniform, and it's not many people have them. So when you see them, it's an automatic sign of respect that, hey, you went through some really tough stuff, and the best of the best graduate Ranger School is a very high attrition rate in that school due to injuries and things of that nature. So the expectations that come with seeing that are that you are a squared away kind of guy, and you'll be at the front of everything when asked. So it's 88 now. Mogadishu doesn't happen for another 5 years until 93. Bridge the gap. What's going on in your career until then?
Well, I got I got to 2nd Ranger Battalion in April, and I walked in there as an E5 promotable. And back in those days, you still had to go to a school down at the regimental headquarters. They call it something different nowadays, but back then it was ROPE, which was Ranger Orientation
right.
Program,
Mm-hmm.
which was a 2-week course you had to go through to, even if you were a native, if you grew up in the battalion and left as an NCO, or you're an officer and you're returning into the regiment, they still make you go through that class. Like I said, I don't know what they call it nowadays, but back then it was a road march and some knots and some operations orders, and just sort of a cultural and physical reintroduction into life in the regiment, so to speak. And so I went there and did that and completed it, and then I came back, and they gave me a team under a squad leader who was already scheduled to leave in a few months, and I think by about July or August, I was a squad leader, got promoted to E6, I think in September, October, and then stayed there, 88 through summer of 92.
Okay. And so then what happens after summer of 92 before you head out to Somalia?
I attended the assessment and selection for the Tier 1 unit at Fort Bragg.
Okay.
In spring of 92. Moved to Fort Bragg in June, which was, I think, 2 weeks after my second child, my son, was born. And I had a 2-year-old and a baby, and had to go start a training course. And my wife stayed at Fort Lewis for what ended up being a year before we got reunited. And I was at Fort Bragg starting in June and finished training, end of the years.
You know what's interesting when you bring that up is that we've talked to so many people on the podcast, and for some reason, it's either their marriage or their kids that are defining marks on the wall for how they time their career out. Like, it's just weird how that for most soldiers is the thing that they associate as a timestamp. It's always, and it always seems to be, I'm leaving for this and I was just about to have a baby, or I'm leaving for this and I just had a baby, or I'm leaving for this and we were going to get married but we had to push it out. You ever notice that when you talk to guys throughout your career, that always seems to be the case? Like, it's never an opportune time to go to Ranger School or to go to Special Forces or whatever it may be.
Yeah, well, you're actually you're more right than you know, because now that you say that, I think back when I left Fort Knox, and the way it worked out, I was at Fort Knox. I went home for a couple weeks of Christmas vacation and got married while I was there. Was already due to go to Fort Lewis, but my PCS orders didn't come until January. So I basically went back to Knox for like a month. Then I went home on a 30 days leave, being married for like a month, and then I had a new bride to take with me to a new life in the Rangers, and and then the other part of this, to go into your point about there's never a good time. I sort of glossed over the part that I went a time previous to the Tier 1 selection course and didn't make it, and when it came time to go back, my wife was pregnant with our second child, so it was kind of I'm walking out the door to go do that for at about 7 months pregnant or so, and then when I got picked up, part of the discussion was my wife was due to have a baby right about the time that the training course starts, plus or minus about a week, and we had a discussion, and they said, hey, if we need to bump you to the training course 6 months hence, if we need to do that, you just let us know. Well, as it worked out, my son came 2 weeks earlier than he was supposed to, which gave me 2 or 3 weeks on the ground with him before I had to leave to report to Fort Bragg, and it just worked out.
And hats off to military spouses, man. I mean, all of them. It's just like, it's unfortunate that the soldiers have to leave them at the times that they do in situations like you said. You already had one kid, you had an infant at home, and you're going off to one of the toughest schools in the military, not being around, but yet there's military spouses there to pick up all the pieces and keep you going. It just it's remarkable how many people we talk to that just have such strong support from families. And I tell people repeatedly, you'd never get through a long military career without that kind of support ever.
No, we wouldn't, and you're exactly right. And if I may, I want to. There's a good, a short.
No, go ahead.
Side note here. I met a guy a few years back he's never been in the military, a little bit older guy, maybe in his 60s or so, and he does some presentations to all over the country really, but he does some talk specifically about post-traumatic stress to military groups of all the branches, and to veterans and things. And I was talking with him one day, and he said, you guys are military service members are what I call, this is him saying this, he goes, you guys are givers in the game of life. You guys just give of yourselves and your service and everything else. And I looked at him and I said, you're probably right, but as far as our families are concerned, we're takers.
Yeah, very much so.
And nobody really acknowledges that, I think, like they should. I certainly didn't while I was on active duty, because I was just, head down, running hard, doing what I thought was right. But, post-military for almost 8 years now, that's more and more in my mind, and I find myself going back and thinking of my wife more and more frequently.
Well, it's tough because
I didn't do it before.
Right. It's so many people who reach, high levels of the military and go to these, elite level schools and tough training and things of that nature. It's a tough struggle, because it's much like you want to say family first, God, family, country. And a lot of cases it's God, country, family. And it's just the mentality with which certain people approach it. And no one can say who's right and who's wrong for that. I think that's up to the individual to figure out what the priority list is. But there's a lot of people who go God, country, family first, or God, country, family in that order. And people have to suffer for that.
No, you're right. You're exactly right. And I think that, if I may, here's the thing, and I have this conversation. I have this conversation with a lot of friends of mine, and with people who are transitioning out of the military. I talk to my family members that I have. My two youngest kids are both in the Army now, and the thing that strikes me is, and I didn't realize while I was in, and I don't think a lot of us realize it because we just don't think about it, but very, very few non-military career choices require the level of personal commitment and physical and mental and emotional commitment that the military does.
Right.
And obviously there's some job specialties in the military require more than others. But for the ones that require a lot of hands-on, a lot of technical acumen and a lot of mental stability and just everything else like that, you can't become good at those things unless you're willing to give up a part of yourself and a part of your identity to become that person. I don't think people think about that and go, "Oh, I'm going to go be an airborne ranger, and therefore I have to give up part of myself." It just happens because of the nature of it. And at some time later, you realize, I didn't realize until after I was already out of the service, but there's a sacrifice there that none of us really is conscious of when it happens, but it affects us, it affects our families, and there's a few, I don't mean to disparage our civilian counterparts or non-military folks, but there's a few jobs out there that require that level of commitment, but not very many.
No, I would agree, and I think most people understand that. Remember, there's only 1% of the country that chooses to put on a uniform and serve, so for the other 99%, I don't think you're going to get much argument. Maybe other public service, firemen, police, whatever it may be, have that same level of commitment, but beyond that, there's not many. So being in the service-based industry, there's a lot of sacrifices that we make. All right, let's kind of fast forward here a little bit. While all that stuff is very important, I don't want to gloss over it, but I want to get back to the points of your military career. So take us to right before you're heading out to Somalia. How did you find out that you were going over there? What were the circumstances? Kind of give us the background.
Let me think here. Where's a good place to start? Actually, I was in a military school, a mandatory school I had to go to down at Fort Benning. And as a result of that, because I had to complete that in a timely manner, so I did not actually set foot in Somalia until weeks after the main element was already there.
Right.
They were there and already working, and I showed up. I guess a good way to say it is probably a week and a half or so before the big, the 3rd of October thing that was represented in the movie.
Right.
All the other operational things that happened prior to that I missed.
Well, and let me kind of just jump in here for a second here, Jason.
That one.
Let me jump in for a second. I apologize, just so people get some background. The raid that we talk about with Black Hawk Down the movie, that happened October 2nd to October 3rd in 1993. But U.S. forces had been in Somalia, I think since August. I think it was 3 months earlier they had gotten there, basically on a peacekeeping mission, although there was some kind of tactical missions going on to go after some of the bad guys there, and Mohammed Faradid, who was the warlord there running everything. There were some missions going on, but there weren't a lot. It was more just peacekeeping, helping to make sure food supplies from the UN were getting to where they were going. So we had a presence on ground for months there before that actual day had happened. So when Jason says that he had gotten there a week before, there had still been a large chunk of special operations folks, Rangers, Army guys on ground already doing work day in and day out. Okay, so you get there a week before October 2nd, whatever it may be. What were you told when you were heading in?
We knew kind of what was going on day to day. I was getting updates from folks, before we left, and we kind of knew what was going on when we arrived. And it was just a matter of, when I got there, getting all my equipment configured and getting integrated, with my team and everything else, getting acclimated to the weather, that sort of thing. That was just sort of an ongoing thing, trying to acclimate to the weather was probably the toughest thing, because even though it was, we had excessively hot summers here in North Carolina. It was, starting to cool off a little bit by late September, and that wasn't the case in Mogadishu at all.
Right. All right. So when you get on ground, what did you see? Was it what you expected? What were your kind of first initial reactions?
I don't know. Just kind of. I don't know. I guess it just was what it was. It was filthy. It was dirty. That's the thing that frankly the movie can't quite convey.
Right.
Is just the level of abject poverty and there's no other word. Just filth that's there. And I don't know. I've never really thought about what my first thoughts were. It was it just was what it was.
Well, let me ask you, because I think it's interesting. Do you get there, and when you look around and you see that, do you almost feel like this is not savable? Because I know in my deployments to Iraq, there were times where you just go through it and you're doing things, and you look at it and you throw your hands up and you go, what are we doing? Like, this is not fixable. And it's almost at a point of frustration and despair. Did you ever feel that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, and it's maybe not fixable. Maybe like God bless the USA, to be stereotypical, and
right.
Thank God I was born where I was and when I was. Every time I visit a country like that, I come away even more and more thankful that I'm American and not something else, just by virtue of when I was born and where.
I think that we don't do that enough, to be honest with you. There's a lot of people who don't do that, especially given the current climate of where we are in 2017. There's more of that needs to go on, but obviously a different discussion for a different day. All right, so the day of October 2nd gets there, and the background for those listening, again, who don't know the story of Black Hawk Down, there was a warlord, Muhammad Faradid, and a bunch of his, for lack of a better term, lieutenants were having a meeting. There was a lot of guys, bad guys, all in one spot at one time, and it was a very juicy, appealing situation for the American forces to try and go get all these guys in one shot because they're all going to be at the same place at the same time. And that was the general purpose of the raid. That morning, as I recall the story, no one was 100% sure that they were going to be going out that day. Do you remember when you woke up, kind of the circumstances were?
Yeah, I mean, I had no expectation that morning when I got up that the day would end the way it did the following morning. It was just another, we kind of had a daily routine that we followed, and I was following that. And probably the most significant thing I can say is, by way of maintaining a fitness schedule and trying to, maintain that edge, me and a few other guys went, and that morning after breakfast but before lunch, we set up a little exercise sort of run back and forth down, a lap along the road, so to speak, and then go back and do some shooting drills along with it. And that lasted for probably close to an hour, and it was excessively difficult. And I remember thinking to myself, that was among workouts that I did, that was a tough one. It was a couple other guys there that I worked with that were, your stereotypical racehorse type of guys, and guys like me have to work like crazy to keep up with them. So that just ended up being an excessively difficult morning. And looking back on it now, I kind of would have probably pared that down a little bit because I didn't know what the rest of the day was going to bring. But
yeah, had I known I was going to be, had you known you were going to be in an 18-hour firefight, you might have probably chose your morning a little bit differently.
Right. And from a larger perspective, for an overall deployment, I would do more maintenance type of stuff. This is a whole side issue and an hour-long discussion all by itself, but I would do more maintenance type of exercise and not so much, gut busting, balls to the wall type of thing.
Right.
But that, like I said, it's a discussion for another day. Anyway, we finished that. And actually, before we finished, let me correct that. One of the guys came over, and we stopped early because he grabbed us and said, "Hey, we need to get ready. We're getting ready to go." So we jumped in the truck and drove back over there real quick and started getting, by the time we got there and started getting equipment ready and everything else, it sort of got called off. It's like, okay, we thought we had something to act on, but we don't. And so then we stood down a little bit, went and got some lunch. And then shortly after lunch, that same scenario started spinning up again. So we kind of got a little bit closer to just kind of, we had some practiced things where it was, hey, sort of a get stage 1 ready. Okay, get stage 2 ready. Okay, now stage 3 is we're going to pick up and actually launch. And anyway, somewhere in that process, it was, okay, here we are, we're ready to go. And then I guess it was somewhere around 3 o'clock, I want to say, 2:30, 3 o'clock that afternoon, we launched. And that's where it all started.
When you
I will tell you that I was a young enough guy there that I don't remember enough of the details about the specific thing other than what you just said, a couple minutes ago. And I know where we were going in and what the intent was, and that's what we launched with. So,
did you feel prepared for the mission? Like, you guys train at such a high level. I'm sure there wasn't much apprehension or worry about having to go do the job, right?
Right. I didn't feel unprepared at all. It was other than, I haven't seen that particular building before, but that's not anything that's really a big concern because just the way we trained, that just wasn't a big concern. The problem was when we hit the ground, we were several blocks away from where we were supposed to be. It was the wrong building. And that was when we kind of started working through some of those problems as far as, okay, wait a minute, we're in the wrong place and we've got to get to the right place. I will tell you, Mark, and this may be a little bit ahead of your next question, but the thing that one of the most striking things that I remember about that day, and it was right there when we ended up in the wrong place and we, get off the street, enter into the first building, and we go in that first room. I see back in the corner a number of people, men and women. Well, it was mostly women and kids, and there was an adult man, probably in his 40s, late 30s or 40s, and he's got, what I assume is his extended family behind him. I didn't really focus on that. The thing that's in my memory that I recall, like crystal clear, was that this adult man, Somali, was holding a probably no more than 2-year-old child up in front of him, like, he has to show that to us to protect himself.
As a shield.
As a shield, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And I remember thinking, even in my lack of experience at that point, I wasn't even 30 years old at the time, and that was the most disgusting thing I probably have ever seen in my life.
I mean, I couldn't...
who would do that?
Yeah, exactly. Like, I just... There's a reason that sticks with you, because most people who are parents, and even most people with any shred of human decency, would cover the child and protect the child, not use them as a human shield. I mean, that speaks to so many things, mostly the conditions in the country that you were in, but that's just, wow. I mean, wrap your head around that for a minute. Dear Lord.
Right. And I just, that was going back a few minutes in the conversation, your question about, what was one of the first things that struck me. Nothing struck me like that, because it was kind of like, if these, and I'll circle back around to this because it makes a bigger point here in a few minutes, but if these people would do that with their own child or extended family member, because I don't know if it was his kid, it might have been a niece or a nephew, or I don't even remember if it was a boy or a girl, but if they would do that, what else would they do? What sort of cultural norms exist in a place like this?
Unreal. And the reason I asked about being prepared is because obviously nobody was prepared for what you were going to walk into, which, for those who don't know the story, you're talking about tens of thousands of armed Somalis in the streets against maybe a total force of 90 to 100 American soldiers. So you were severely outnumbered in the entire raid. And it was supposed to be about 30, 40 minutes from, the time you guys get on ground and the time that you get everybody and get out. It was supposed to be a fairly quick operation. And obviously it didn't happen that way. So you get on ground and you find out you're at the wrong building. Did you ever get to the right building?
No, no, I don't believe so. We cleared that first room and which was the first building we went into to get off the street, and realized that we were in the wrong place, trying to make some radio calls. And again, this was the leader in my own, not me. I'm not making any calls at all. I'm hearing what's going on the radio, but that wasn't my thing. So we pushed out to the sidewalk and went to the corner of the building to kind of, we were gonna move down the street to where we needed to be, and me and another guy were we sort of took a quick look around the corner, and he turned the corner on his knee in front of me and covered down a little alleyway, and I was covering the original direction that we were kind of looking down the street. He was turning right around the corner there, and two things happened at once. I saw a chunk of something splattered off the corner of the building, and he fell backward at my feet, and laying on the ground looking up at me, and I bent over, and so I'm upside down to him, and I'm like, "Did you get shot?" And he goes, "No." He sits back up, and then he goes, "I just saw a helicopter get shot down right over there."
Wow.
And I couldn't see it because I wasn't around the corner, but he watched it sort of, whatever, counter rotate or whatever it did, I don't know. He watched it go down off the horizon, and that was the moment I knew that we had issues. We had a problem, because that certainly was not part of the plan.
Yeah, I mean, that's got to be an incredibly sinking feeling. Now, again, for those listening who aren't military and aren't 100% familiar with the story, the story is called Black Hawk Down because a helicopter gets shot down. In fact, two of them got shot down, and that automatically changed it from a raid and an assault to an entirely different, mission. And basically, hey, we got to get all of our guys out of here and make sure we're safe and destroy the American equipment so they can't get any information from it. So it changes the mission dramatically. But when he tells you that, are you essentially like crapping your pants?
No, it was just more of a oh hell. Forgive me for putting it so crudely, but it's in modern vernacular that I get from my kids and other young folks that I work with sometimes. That's kind of one of those moments where you're like, okay, shit just got real.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? It was real enough before, but that's a significant increase in, holy crap, here we go. And at that point, it was okay. Now we've got to get to and I don't remember the timeline off the top of my head. I don't know if the one that I'm pretty sure the one that he saw was the first one down, Durant's helicopter. But we in pretty short order made it to an area where we could get accountability and bring everybody together, launch a quick plan, and then get to confirm the location of where the helo was, and then start moving that direction. And some point in that whole sequence is where the other bird went down, and because we had command platform and eyes in the sky, people had a pretty good idea. We did not move to Durant's location. We went to the other location.
Is that because you were closer?
I'm sorry?
Is that because you were closer to the second helicopter that went down? Is that just a proximity thing?
I think it was. Yeah, I think the other one was too far to get to. Again, I would defer to anyone who happens to be listening to this who knows the story better than me. I have a lot of holes in my memory about this, so I don't remember if that was really the reason. So someone could go, oh yeah, you don't know what you're talking about because of this. I'll fully admit that. I just remember we went to one, and it was certainly closer than the other one was. So that was probably the reason.
When you get to that downed helicopter, was it chaos? What did you see?
Not from my perspective. I was across the street. We had other guys that were over there. I did not be just because of the way everything was in the built up part of the city and the intersection where we were close to. I did not physically lay eyes on that helicopter at all, ever. I was just, across the street, pulling security in different directions and just, letting other people do their job. It just wasn't where I was. And it was from my perspective. I think if you had a bird's eye view, it looked quite chaotic. From my perspective, it was and it wasn't. There was.
How much shooting's going on right now? Like how much gunfire is going on as you're pulling security?
It was intermittent, depending on, where the locals were probing, which direction they were coming from. We had superb coverage from helo gunships, which was, invaluable. They did a lot. Our guys on the ground were in direct contact with them and could call in fire missions for, specifically down to like a half a block. It worked very, very well, and that actually helped us a lot. But indescribably, it was of a benefit. There's no doubt. But it just was what it was. It's hard to watch. You're talking an 18-hour, 16-hour sequence on the ground that they try to compress into, an hour and a half or 2 hours on the movie screen. So
right.
The movie screen depiction lends itself to this just constant,
Sure.
bullets flying both directions nonstop, and that's just not the reality,
At this point in time,
there was plenty of that, but it wasn't nonstop like it is in the movie. I'm
Sure.
sorry, go ahead.
No, I mean, at any point in time, is somebody get hit? Does somebody around you get shot? I mean, what are you hearing on the radio? Kind of set that scene a little bit.
When we pulled up to the actual site, we moved down the street. When we pulled up to the actual site, a couple of my buddies that were in front of us were already treating a couple of the Ranger casualties. Pulled them out of the street. And were begun treating them for gunshot wounds when we arrived, and then they, just because it was where they were going, the rest of their team had already secured the piece across the street, so they moved over to the other side of the street, and me and a couple of the guys took over, sort of, watching one or two casualties, and the medic was there, and he's like, hey, this and this and this, and watch this guy for this and do that, and so we had a bit of a conversation with that kid, and he was a gunshot victim, and he survived that.
Do you remember his name?
Recovered from it and went on years later, but we had, a few others in a different room in the house and kind of collected him into a casualty collection point, just like any military operation where the medics can work in one area.
Do you remember his name?
I do, but I'd rather not say.
Okay. I mean, that's understandable.
Without his permission.
No, that's fine. You don't.
The other thing that was telling was that we got there just as the sun was getting really low in the sky. So by the time we got to that point, and I remember very specifically, you always train to keep your eye protection on, so you don't, back when I first came in the Army, nobody wore eye protection at all for anything. And I even remember when that stuff first got introduced, everybody was like, I'm not wearing glasses. This is stupid. There's no need for it. But by the time, the early 90s rolled around, it was kind of like a minimum thing for, at least for live fire stuff. Now we wear IPO for everything under the sun. But I remember very specifically trying to pull security toward a direction where the setting sun was, and my lenses on my iPro were so fogged up that I had to take them off. I just took them off and put them on top of my helmet or put them in my pocket or something, because I was like, okay, this is unsafe from the I might lose my eyesight perspective, but it's even more unsafe if I can't see because my glasses are completely fogged up. They were like goggles. So I just took them off and put them away, and I never put them back on again for the rest of the night, just because it was so hot and I sweat so much that just wasn't an option.
Let me ask you about the casualties and everything else. I mean, was that the first person you saw wounded in combat? Because I would tend to think, much like a car accident on the side of the road, when you hear somebody's kind of shot or bleeding or whatever, the natural instinct would be to want to see it, to go, like, what's going on? Like, is he okay? And does that distract you at all?
No, by the time I got there, he was already, had a bandage on, had a dressing on, and they were in the. No, it was never to the point where I had to do anything like that, and the reaction for me was just like, I'll be honest with you, Mark, across this entire thing, only one part of it, which was the following morning when we left out of there, was harder than training I had done. All the training I had done was more difficult than what I saw there, other
Really?
than, bullets coming back up range. But, and I don't mean this to sound like, it's like, whatever, this is too easy. That wasn't the case at all. I just remember to myself thinking, I always thought this was going to be so much harder than this, and it's kind of the same. And that helped me relax a little bit and keep my wits about me, just because it's like, okay, well, here we are, and I'm not right at the critical edge of dying every split second like I've been led to believe, earlier on in my career.
Right.
How you're doing something in the Army, and it's, what are you going to do now? And there's all this stress, and they induce all this stress because they don't know really what else to do, because you can't shoot at people. And once it was there, it was like, okay, I got it. And I hesitate to say that because it kind of sounds cocky and arrogant, and that's not what I'm saying at all. It was just this realization that, like, okay, I can do this. This isn't like I was led to think it was.
Well, and let me explain just for some of the people listening. I get it. I understand because I've worn a uniform, but to those who think that it may be cocky, it's not, because when you get to the level that Jason has achieved in his career, as far as the schools and the training that he's gone through, they train you for that. So when the moment comes, it's not overwhelming. And even when it is, a lot of the guys we've spoken to still subdue it. They'll say, yeah, it was pretty tough, but like, they don't ever tell you, we were overwhelmed, we weren't prepared. Because right. You guys have trained so much for this. So it's, although it comes off as cocky and it's like, oh, it's no big deal. Hey, listen, people died in this thing. You're not being callous about it, but there are certain people who have reached certain levels of the military that have trained so much for these moments that when they do happen, they are mentally prepared for it. Physically, you're always going to be prepared because of the way you train, but it's the mental preparation for moments like this that really is the edge that certain people at certain levels have that just regular soldiers, regular Joes don't.
Right, exactly. And when you do casualty training as part of your training, when it happens for real, you go, oh, I've done this before. Okay, I got it. I mean, I have not maybe seen that particular gunshot wound in that particular place on the body on that person, but the concept is the same, and it's like, okay, it's just not that big of a deal. I remember one of the Rangers, and I don't remember his name at all. A little bit later, when we were kind of hunkered down inside the house, but still before the sunset. But he got shot kind of through the foot. It was almost like the bullet went through and like sort of just sliced through half of his ankle.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember seeing through. I ended up putting a bandage on him, and it didn't bleed. It was an open wound, and you could see bones and tissue and everything else down inside of it, but it wasn't like oozing blood. There was no blood coming out of it. Just the bandage was really as much to protect it as anything else. But it was kind of like I had about a split second where I looked at it and go, well, it's not actually even really bleeding, and that's a hell of a wound. He's probably got 50 bones in his foot that are going to need to get repaired or whatever. I don't even know. But a split second later, it was like, okay, put a bandage on it and onto the next thing, and whatever. It just is what it is.
As I mentioned before, the whole thing was only supposed to take 35, 40 minutes, whatever it was. And now the sun's starting to set. You go in around 3 o'clock, the sun is starting to set. So you're 3 hours later and it gets dark. At any point in time, are you starting to think, man, when the hell are we going to get out of here? What the hell's going on? What's taking so long? Like, is there any disorientation about it?
I didn't really have a good appreciation for. I just kind of thought we were on this delay. It was, there was some radio chatter going on about, this and that, and it was kind of, hey, the radio calls were going to the guys that were in charge of, the main reason we were there was to, never leave a fallen comrade. So we were recovering fallen comrades essentially. And the radio calls kept going, hey, what's the status? When are you going to be ready to move? And the call kept coming back from that team leader over there saying, we're still working, and every 30 minutes or whatever. Well, I don't even remember what the sequence was, but at some point, probably around, 10 or 11 o'clock that night, maybe 9 o'clock. I don't remember. But at some point, he came back on the radio and he said, we're going to be here a while. I will call you when we're done. And then the radio broke squelch. And at that point, I was like, okay, we're not getting out of here till sunup. And that was just my own realization. Nobody came and told me that. It just was what it was,
So what was the emotions at that point in time?
I was just resigned to the fact that that's what was going to happen. I mean, I remember thinking to myself, I am no longer thinking, because I wasn't anticipating that we were going to leave. I wasn't stressed out because it was taking too long as the hours ticked on into the evening. I just remember thinking, okay, well, we're still here, we're still here. And then that call came in, and finally that guy, there was a bit of a change in his voice, in the tone of his voice, and he said, we're going to be here a while. I'll call you when we're done. Or something to that effect. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was just whatever it was, and the change in his tone of voice, I came to the realization right then. It was like, okay, we're not getting out of here till sunup. And I kind of have this mental trick I always play on myself where I go, okay, well, if I know I'm not leaving till sunup, anything before that is good. Anything prior to that is cake. So I'm here till breakfast. Bottom line.
Was anybody around you upset? Was anybody around you in despair, or were they like, "Hey, we're going to die here"? I mean, or was everybody cool, calm, and collected about it?
Not at all. No, not at all. Matter of fact, the closest, first line leader that I had that I was working directly for right then, at one point after we'd been there for about a half an hour, maybe an hour, and we realized we were kind of going to be there this is still, right before sundown, or say between sundown and the end of dusk where it actually gets dark. And he came in and he's like, okay, there's gunfire going on, intermittently all around us, for just kind of like it did. And he comes in, he goes, okay, crossload whatever water you got, and we're going to go into shifts, and we're going to put guys at certain places to pull security, and this and that. And he was just kind of putting out some information, and this is the other thing that I remember very clearly about that day more than anything else. He was the coolest, calmest, cool as a cucumber cat I'd ever seen in my life. It was just like, yeah, he might as well have been reading to me a story out of the newspaper while we were having coffee on Sunday morning.
Wow.
Like, okay, this and that, blah, blah, blah. Here's this, do that, do this, okay. And that, I tell people, I do some training nowadays for some law enforcement folks here and there and some military guys. And I tell folks, whenever I get the opportunity that, cool-headedness and panic are both just equally contagious like the other one is. If you're cool-headed and you're keeping your wits about you, you're going to help other people around you follow your example. If you fly off the handle and you're panicked and can't control yourself, that's contagious as well.
100% true. It's just
and he was just the coolest guy you could possibly imagine. It was just like, I always thought that was the baddest ass thing I'd ever seen.
And it just for civilians listening, yeah, I would love that too. I mean, for civilians listening, it's the same thing. When parents go nuts, their kids follow suit. I mean, it's just when parents start screaming and panicking, their kids get nervous. It's the same sort of leadership principle. When the guy in charge is saying, "Hey, we got this, we're good," it's just a calming feeling for everybody else. If they're good about it, we'll be good about it because we've all kind of gone through this stuff together. All right, so you're there overnight, and I assume, as you said, the gunfire is just intermittent throughout the evening. Sun comes up. What's happening? Give us the kind of the scene.
At some point, and again, my recollection of the exact timing is somewhat lacking, but at some point, the leader who made the call the night before about, hey, this is going to take us a while, we'll call you, when we're done. At some point they got done and they were ready. Everything was ready to go, and then we had to get, somebody up the chain of command arranged for a foreign country to come in with armored vehicles, and they literally backed the vehicle up to the door, and we ran out the door. I mean, the back door of their armored vehicle was pressed against the doorway to our building. And we jumped in the vehicle and they drove us out of there. And then at a certain point I know I'm telling this sequence-wise, I'm telling this incorrect, but the famous or infamous, whichever your perspective happens to be, Mogadishu Mile, which was, we moved on foot. That either happened from the crash site to where we got picked up, or we got picked up first, and then we went to a place and then had to do that out of there. And again, if anybody that I know listens to this story, they're going to think, what a dumbass! I can't believe you don't remember that. But it's been so many years, and I just remember. I remember riding in the vehicle, and I remember doing the Mogadishu Mile. I don't remember which one happened first. Frankly.
Okay. Well, for those, again, let me kind of give you some background, at least historically.
Sure, I apologize.
No, that's fine. Just for clarification. And at the end of the movie, you see this. The vehicles get so jam-packed because they had so many wounded, they had so many people to get in them, and obviously they didn't bring enough of them, that they were told to kind of get on the roof and they'll ride out. But meanwhile, there's gunfire shooting, and a lot of guys just admitted they felt safer on the ground on their own with their weapon as opposed to sitting on the top of a vehicle like a sitting duck slowly rolling out of the city. And so what happened was is a bunch of guys, and Jason, you may know the number better than I do, but it's a handful of maybe 10 to 12 guys. Once the vehicles took off, they hit the gas and went. And even if people were in it, they just gone. And then now you got 10 to 12 guys standing there going, well, that was our ride. So now we have no other choice. We can either stay here and continue to be in a fight by ourselves, or we can just start running the hell out of the city. And that's exactly what happened. And it was about a mile from where they were to the soccer stadium where everybody was meeting, hence why they get the name the Mogadishu Mile. What do you remember about the run itself? Does anything stand out? Yeah,
this is, I don't remember what we were talking about maybe 30 minutes ago, but I alluded to that, that I swore to God that I would never skip a day of PT as long as I lived.
Right.
Because I was so exhausted. I've never run harder or longer. I felt like my heart was going to split out of my chest. That was the worst one ever. And of course, I'm just as lazy as anybody else. So when I got the chance, I took my breaks from doing PT like like anybody else would. But it was just the sheer duration and intensity of having to keep up and moving.
Were you being shot at while running?
I know that we were. I personally don't remember being shot at, but there was a lot of us that were engaging targets. I don't remember being shot at directly. That doesn't mean I wasn't. I don't have a recollection.
So as you're running this mile out, I mean, is everybody relatively staying together, or were guys just in a full out sprint? Did you feel like it was like you were carrying a refrigerator in your back? What was going on in your mind?
It was fairly well ordered. It wasn't. We didn't have a breaking contact, so it was. We were moving as a group, like we would. It just the sheer, and everybody wanted to get out of there safely, so we were probably moving at a rate of speed a little bit faster than we would otherwise, and it was just extremely physically taxing. That's all. It was just fast and.
So when you see the soccer stadium within vision, like or is there a point where you realize, hey, I'm safe? Or when you see that soccer stadium, you're running up to it, you're like, oh God, thank God I made it.
Well, we got to a certain point where we linked up with armored vehicles. I remember getting in an armored vehicle, and then we got out of that. And when I got out of it, I saw other people that were already there at the location, sort of. You could tell when you get out of the vehicle and you see the first 10 people that you see, and their demeanor is not that they're in the middle of a gunfight. They're directing people to vehicles and trying to, marshal forces and get guys loaded up. So that tells you that, you're relatively safe and there's nobody actively shooting right there at that very second. So then we transferred over to some Humvees driven by some 10th Mountain guys. Got on that, and then we drove that all the way back to the airfield. And the only thing I remember about that was at one point, and I mean I didn't meet any of those guys from that unit. There was just a bunch of Army guys on a Humvee, and I don't know, 4, 5, 6 of us, whatever it was, got onto this truck, and we started driving and in convoy. And at a certain point, I mean, knowing that the convoy situation was what it was the day before and the night before, we're in a convoy, so we stop, and this kid on this 50 cal on the top of the truck starts launching. He shoots about I don't even know, 50, probably a full box of ammo.
Wow.
Kind of down the street and into this building. And, he got a bit of a break in fire, and we were not under direct fire at that point. And I remember, we were still in the middle of the city somewhere. I don't know where we were. I wasn't, we didn't have GPS. I wasn't keeping track of where we were exactly. I didn't know how far we had to get until we got back to the safety of the airfield. So he had a bit of a break there, and I reached up and grabbed his leg, and he turned around, and I was like, hey, you might want to save some of that ammo because we might need it a little bit later. A couple other guys looked at me like, what the hell are you talking about? I'm like, well, we're not. I mean, I didn't need to explain to them that we weren't under direct fire. It was just kind of like, look, we only got so much. Don't burn through it right here, And then we were moving again, and it didn't really matter. And a few minutes later, we got back, and it was all over.
When you get back and it is all over, what were you feeling? What were you thinking? Was there a sense of relief, or was it there just a sense of? Did you grasp a sense of how many people were hurt, how many people were dead, so on and so forth?
Yeah, I didn't. As you can imagine, we weren't. There wasn't the available. There's just nobody was making calls over the radio during the night, keeping track of that stuff. That's just not what you do. You know that. Some of your listeners may not know that, but you show up back there and you find out kind of what the gravity of the situation really was, and then the big thing that was first was the same guy that was cool as a cucumber that night before came to us, and he goes, hey, and as you know, the two Medal of Honor recipient snipers that we had, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, were both missing at this point. And I believe they were already KIA at that point. But what I was told, me and a couple of buddies of mine were told, was they're unaccounted for. And my first reaction was, okay, I'm loading magazines and grabbing some water and let's go. We'll go back out and get them. And this same cool as a cucumber leader, he's like, hey, that's not going to happen. He goes, we don't know where they are. We don't have any. It was kind of like the dad and the hot-headed son. It's like, look, sit down, take a breath. What you're saying is yay for you and your passion, but doing that exact thing right now is a losing game. We don't know what we're doing. We're not just going to launch willy-nilly to go do something like that. And of course he was right, and I calmed down after a little while, and and then things progressed, and we learned what happened, and et cetera, et cetera.
When you learned of their final fate, what were you feeling?
Right.
What were you feeling though when you heard when it was definitive that you told that they were KIA? Was
Well, I mean, we learned kind of the whole story about them. They requested the first 2 times to go in on Durant's crash site and help him out, and got told no the first 2 times by the airborne command platform. The commander. And he's negative, denied, and then the third time it was like, I think the third time was kind of like, hey, look, boss, we're going in, one way or the other. There's guys right there, we can see them, they need our help, and so we knew that story, and also the, what the ultimate disposition was that they were both KA. It was kind of like, okay, and then just as time passed, we got more and more information, and this and that, and people are that's probably the part of the story that most people are familiar with than anything else, frankly.
I mean, is it tough because I'm sure you were proud of them, but at the same time you were hurting? I mean, how do you reconcile the difference in those emotions? Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It was just,
I'll be honest with you. That was it took me a long time to process that. Those were two guys that were, like I said earlier in the conversation, I was pretty young in the organization. They were not pretty young in the organization, so I did not have more than a couple of sentences of interaction with either one of them. I knew who they were, and I had a lot of respect for them, but I didn't know them personally. So it affected me, but not as much as it did some guys who were close friends of theirs after years of time together. But it's always hard. Even it doesn't matter how well you know somebody. That's just a tough situation. It's always hard.
When you look back on the whole event, what do you think? What do you feel? Are there any regrets?
No, I don't. No. I can tell you this. One of my, kind of a side story, one of my friends told me after the fact, because we had a few guys, quite a number of guys get wounded, everything from, severe wounds that were life changing to, a flesh wound, so to speak. I don't want to detract from it, but anyway, one of the guys who was injured but not so badly, told me years later that, because we ended up on the same team, 3-4 years later, and he said, yeah, I was laying there in the hospital ward, and it was some of our guys and some of the Rangers, and the chaplain comes walking through thinking that there's people that need to talk, and he's kind of going down the line, and some guys are talking about this, and they have regrets, and there's some guys that lost close friends, and there's some tears and some other stuff, and that's all fine and good, and I got no issues with any of that. But my buddy who's telling me the story and he ended up in the convoy, back and forth in the convoy, which was horrific by all accounts. And the chaplain came to him, and he's like, they're talking a little bit, and he goes, well, do you have any regrets? And my buddy looked at him and he goes, yeah, I do. I wish I had more 40 mil ammo and more magazines. And
heart of a soldier.
And the poor chaplain, he didn't know what to say to that. And I asked him, I'm like, you really said that? And he goes, yeah. I won't talk to that guy. I've got nothing to say to him. He's like, it is what it is. And, I said, you actually said that to me? He goes, yeah. And he pretty much just walked away. And, everyone else, most of the other guys said a similar thing.
Yeah, I think most of the people we've talked to about Mogadishu, the general reaction is things went down. Everybody understands, for lack of a better phrase, if you're going to make an omelet, you got to break some eggs, so bad things are going to happen. But I think a lot of people feel incomplete, like either they weren't really prepared for what was going to go on, and they didn't prepare to go into the raid as best they could, or they didn't get to finish the job the way they wanted to. And I think that's what sticks with a lot of people in Mogadishu the most.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
I mean, so that's kind of the regret portion of it, and because you did everything you could do with what you had, it's just a question of, had you known better or had you had more information, you would have. I think a lot of people feel like the outcome would have been different. Like they had control the whole time. Like you guys were never out of control. You just didn't have enough information to know how things were going to go, and so therefore. I hate to say lack of preparedness because I don't think anybody was unprepared. I just think the way the situation unfolded, no one expected to see what they were going to see. And obviously lessons learned, and that's kind of like a good way to bridge into what you're doing now after the military, because as a consultant for Strategic Link Partners, which is the company you're working with, you handle a lot of these things. You work with lessons learned in the Army and things of that nature and speaking groups. And what do you take from this experience that you tell people as you go forward?
That's a good question, I'll give you a bit of a long answer, and I apologize up front. A lot of people that have some experience but not a lot assume that there's a what I call the silver bullet answer. What's the one thing that I need to do, to solve this problem, and it's kind of a friend of mine jokingly refers to it as, it's the 5-finger death punch, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's that one silver bullet answer that solves all problems? And the reality is there's not one. It's It's basic level. People don't understand that basic level tasks done consistently hundreds or thousands of times create a consistency of mindset and a level of performance that is what carries the day. You know, they think it's like, oh, you're just naturally talented, or you're this, or you're that. It's like, no, okay, you have some people who are a little bit more genetically gifted. For example, they have better hand-eye coordination, or they have, maybe a little bit higher cognitive ability, but they still have to practice, and you have to build those tasks, those skills, I should say, to do certain things. And then, the true mastery of it as an organization is, everybody doing those things consistently well, so that when it comes time to react to something like what happened in Mogadishu, all of your basic level stuff is already taken care of, and that sort of well-oiled machine just continues to chug along, and then you continue to pack things onto it. So it's like a train moving down the tracks. If it's got a strong engine and it's moving, you got fuel in it, you can put as many items of cargo, or for an on the ground scenario, or for a combat situation, or a law enforcement shooting, you can put as many difficult and timely tasks and crises on top of it, but the foundation's not going to break down because everything gets done correctly instead of half-assed. A lot of people don't realize that.
No, it's a lesson for the military, but it's also a lesson for life. I think you can use it in any corporate environment or anything else. It's just it's the way it's applied that may be a little bit different, but it certainly is something that rings true for everybody, and everybody listening. Doesn't have to be military or anything else, or firemen or police. Even in the business world, that same type of ideology applies. When you do simple tasks over and over again well, it makes bigger tasks and bigger things a lot easier to accomplish. Well, Jason, look, I mean, your entire career has been nothing short of remarkable in what you've done in the military, and obviously what you're doing in your post-career. But the story is just unreal. The point of view is something that I think everybody can appreciate, and it's one of the most notable battles that our country has ever served in for many different reasons. And the fact that you were there and survived and came back to tell the story, I think, is unbelievable. And we just appreciate you sharing it with us.
Well, I appreciate your comments, and thanks for your patience and your time. I'm really happy to get a chance to talk with you.
You've been listening to the Hazard Ground Podcast, hosted by Mark Zeno and produced by Matt Pasquarella. If you have an interesting story to tell and you'd like to be on the show, send us an email at hazardgroundpodcast@gmail.com. And if you like the show, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.